Well, it's that time again, time for a mold making tutorial, and Mothman features prominently in this tutorial. This is going to be pretty straight and to the point. I have a little Mothman sculpture, totally awesome Mothman sculpture, I might say, by the very talented Michael Brower, who has appeared in tutorials along our history here at Biddy Mold Supply. Michael Brower and I were co-workers many moons ago, and he has sculpted, I think, a Christmas ornament for us in the past, and you can find him scattered throughout the video library that we have. But at any rate, Michael sculpted this for us. This is his interpretation of Mothman, and this is a very conniving looking Mothman. And what I wanted to cover in this particular tutorial is material selection and mold design. So that's one of the things we get a lot of questions about, and it's really mold making as a trade is really an exercise in problem solving. So this is one of those things that really defines you as a mold maker. If this is something you do as a profession or just molding your own work, really having people bring you strange things or sculpting something and then taking a step back from it and deciding how that's going to be molded, it's always different. And that's the kind of thing that some people love that about mold making, and some people, it drives them absolutely crazy. I was actually in the latter of those two. It used to drive me nuts, and now the older I get, the more fun I have in that process of looking at a sculpture and trying to figure out the best configuration. Now, to his credit, Michael is an excellent sculptor and very good at sculpting things that lend themselves to be molded. And that's another thing I'm going to cover really quickly here, is you notice people who have, sculptors who have had their work molded and cast before are much better at planning out their sculpt and doing things like Mothman's little antennas here. You notice they don't just stick straight up. They're laid back and they connect back with his wings here. So we still get the idea. We know exactly what that is. We can tell what we're looking at, but he's configured this in such a way as to make for an easier mold and cast. It's one of those things that if this is your piece and you're sculpting it and you're designing it, don't make it more difficult than it has to be. So if you can sculpt it in a way as to get the design across, but also in a way that is more conducive to mold making and casting, definitely do that. And one fun little exercise is to go in some little giftware shops that sell little statues and look at those, because it's always a good idea to look at how other people tackle those kinds of mold making problems. So you can see how Michael kept the little Mothman's arms up here, which we get that really conniving kind of expression, but also that keeps those little arms, makes them very easy to mold. So lots of good planning on this sculpture that of course lends itself to the mold making and casting process. Because one of the things we have to do later on is we always want to be thinking of this upside down, which I'm not going to flip this over right now, but you want to be thinking about your casting material coming in through the base and flowing up and the air coming out. So Mothman's wings are thick enough that they can allow for the resin to travel through those wings and fill them up easily. And that base is wide enough, we shouldn't have any problem pouring through that. So lots of little things like that. Again, Michael is a great designer on this sort of thing. And also one of the things that he did is by carrying those wings all the way down to the base, that gives, one, the sculpture has more strength, but also we don't wind up with those legs being these thin little areas that we have to pour through, which makes the pouring more difficult and also makes the sculpture more prone to breakage in shipping. So lots of little considerations like that, again, that you get when you are a seasoned sculptor like Mr. Brower. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and commence with a mold. And like I said, we're going to keep that part of the tutorial pretty straightforward, because again, I really want to cover more configuration and just design of how we're going to do this, make this mold, and what materials we're going to select for this. So what I'm going to do is make a block mold, just a simple rectangular mold that covers little Mothman. And I want enough clearance, just right around an inch at those widest points, Because what I'm going to do is a lot like some of the previous videos we've done. He's going to open like a book and hinge around the top of his little Mothman head, and that way we don't have any seams right up here. So what we're going to do is cut the seam right along the edge of that wing and right along the edge of this wing, and then it's going to be like a book facing down that opens kind of like a clamshell or like a book up around him and pops off. Now the reason we're doing that is by keeping that top, or the spine, so to speak, of the book together, that gives us a good alignment point where we don't have to worry about anything shifting and getting out of whack later on. So real important to think all of these things through first before you start making your mold. Now the other thing here is, if these wings were any different, it would probably require a vent of some sort to make sure that our resin travels up and through the wings. But Michael, again, made the consideration of connecting those wings down to the base. So that allows, we don't have any hard edges here, any corners or any tips where that might entrap air. So all of those considerations are really important. And again, this is why back when I did just professional mold making of just random stuff people brought me, I would spend sometimes a few hours just looking at a piece, trying to get a feel for it, and try to think through all those problem areas, again, before I start pouring or brushing rubber onto a part, because the more of that you can do beforehand, and the more experience you have as a mold maker, the better you'll be at configuring that and troubleshooting those things before they even happen. So again, being able to think through just the fluid dynamics of how that casting resin is going to flow, how that mold is going to open, where those seams are going to be. And again, the other thing we have to think about is we're going to be cutting those seams, and how difficult will it be to chase the seams, because obviously we're going to have some flashing there. So we don't want flashing. Obviously you don't want a seam right down the front of Mothman here, because that's a lot of cleanup work. So we're going to keep those to right along the wing tips or the edges of the wings, and we're going to, in the mold, we're going to cut it only as far as is necessary to get Mothman out. Now possibly later on we'll make a follow-up video where we mold Mothman again with the different techniques. I have a few different ideas for how he can be molded, and I want to make sure all those are represented on our channel. But for now, we're going to go with that simple block mold, again with just a foam core box in a rectangular shape. Now, for material selection, we are going to use tin cure silicone, and here's why. Michael Brower sculpted this in his shop. Now, he is a careful guy, so I don't think he was smearing sulfur all over the part or anything like that. But anytime something's been out of my control and I don't know exactly what he's used for the eyes or the teeth and things like that, just to be on the safe side, we're going to go with a tin cure silicone. So we're going to use the 5092 silicone to pour this up, and we are going to vacuum degas this because we might be pressure casting. I don't know just yet how we're going to be casting Mothman, but just to be on the safe side, we're going to use properly vacuum degassed 5092 silicone. And that's going to be a step I'm not going to show just for the sake of time and dragging the vacuum chamber in front of the camera. We're just going to vacuum degas off camera and pour. Now the first thing we're going to need to do with Mothman is secure him to a base. And normally I would put some clay around this, but we're not even going to worry about that because this base really isn't going to be a critical part of the mold. We're going to make an allowance for that in our box, but that's really not critical. The real base of the piece is right here. Now, again, what I'm allowing for here is right about an inch, maybe a little bit less of clearance on those wings. Now, you could easily use melamine-coated plywood or particle board or MDF for this, but as evidenced by many of my tutorials, I really like foam core board. And the main reason for that is foam core board is easy to cut, it doesn't require a table saw, and makes a nice clean mold, and it's cheap. So Most office supply places will have different thicknesses of foam core board, and they're perfect for this. This sheet of foam core board, I think, runs maybe like $3 or $4 at an office supply. And there's easily enough to cut up and make this whole box. Now, because this is kind of a funky area here on the seam, I am going to reinforce this with a little spine here of more foam core board. Now, sometimes on boxes like this, some of these deeper mold boxes, it's a good idea to reinforce these with some additional material. So I'm just going to take some scrap foam core board and use that to reinforce the sides of my box. Now, one last little detail, I always like to keep my hot glue gun handy just in case I need to reinforce something in the middle of the mold. So I'm going to turn it off for now, but I like to keep that on standby just in case. Now, one other little consideration, one reason I want to make absolute sure my little guy here is anchored well to this board is I'm going to need to tip him backwards. And the reason I need to do that is right under his little paws or his little hooves or whatever his anatomy is, we have some places that might trap air bubbles. Probably not, but just in case, what I'm going to do is as I'm filling up this mold box, I'm going to tip it back, and that way any air bubbles as that's tipped back can float up and away from the front. The back I don't think is going to be a problem at all, but that front, there's just a couple of areas where it looks like there might be air entrapment. Now, of course, we got to release it. The release agent is not so much for keeping the silicone from sticking to our clay, because this is monster clay. It's a very waxy clay, so we don't have to worry about any release issues there. But we do want to make sure that everything comes out as clean as possible to minimize cleanup on our mold. And of course, we don't want it sticking to the mold box and making that stuck permanently to it. And every now and then, you could have a silicone that really wants to grab onto your mold box. Now, it's always a good idea, anytime you're applying your mold release to a piece like this, you can see some of that coming off the top because it's in an enclosed space like that. Always a good idea to give that plenty of time. I usually give it about 20 or 30 minutes for all of that to dissipate, because anytime you're spraying release on something, you want to give it some time for that release to dry, because some releases, depending on their composition, if you don't allow them to flash off, what you'll wind up with is little pinhole bubbles all on the inside of your mold. So real important, give your mold time, or give your cast, once you've sprayed it with a release, give it time to dry, and any of those solvents or propellant to flash off, and then pour your silicone. Okay, we are now ready to demold our finished mold of our Mothman. And this is like Christmas. We're gonna get to open up this little dude and check him out. Now, normally I will put some instructions on the baseboard, like front, back, sides, cut here, that sort of thing. Not really necessary here. This is a trapezoid shape, so I've got a pretty good idea how everything's oriented, but we're gonna open it up and see what we got. And again, this is about 24 hours, actually this is about 16 hours after the pour. All right, now we're ready to cut Mothman loose from his chrysalis. I don't know if that's the right origin for Mothman or not, but I always like to use a scalpel. You can pick up a lot of these scalpels. Sometimes we have them. It's all about availability. Through all the COVID stuff, some of this stuff got difficult to get. Some stuff got easier to get. But scalpels are one of those things that unfortunately are tricky to get sometimes. But non-sterile scalpel blades are relatively cheap, but they're much sharper. Just remember, these little guys are a lot sharper than X-Acto knives and X-Acto blades. So be aware of that. That's why we have a little silicone stopper to keep that from stabbing anybody. And what we're going to do is cut down on the edge of his wing here and here. And again, open this dude up like a book. So it's going to hinge right across Mothman's head and shoulders. Okay, we're about to cut this open. I have an anonymous assistant over here to the side who wishes to be remain unnamed because of our sordid reputation. So what we're going to do here is, this is the front. Okay, if you could, and lucky me, I found went right to his wing. Now what I'm doing here is I'm cutting that little S-shaped cut at the top, but then as I get closer to the piece, it's almost like a cone shape. So the S cut is here, and as I get closer to the clay model, I'm straightening out my cut. And the reason for that is I don't want to have that wavy cut, if I can avoid it, right up against the piece. I mean, sometimes that's unavoidable, but I want that to be fairly straight and just the seam to have those teeth in it. That way that interlocks really good, and that way you have a good lock on two different planes, both this way and this way. Rupert, you good?
Yep.
Right up at Mothman's nervous little face. So let's flip him over, and this is a very nervous looking Mothman.
Mm-hmm.
Which I imagine Mothman would be, because he's constantly trying to avoid bug lights and highway traffic and mothballs. Really important step, probably the most valuable tip in this video. Put your scalpel back in its hole. Okay, Rupert, you want to see if you can pull that out? Sorry, I keep saying your name.
That's okay.
Oh, all right. And there we go. Now, of course, the beauty of this is, look at that seam. Look at that nice cut seam. If I was a seam, I'd want to be that seam. And there we go. Our cut block mold ready for casting. And because this is such a cool little piece, I'm going to clean the mold out, and we're going to wrap up the video with a cast of Mothman. Okay, it's time now to cast our Mothman. We've got our mold taped up here, and I'm just going to pour some of our simple art cast resin into the mold. And just remember, on a first cast like this is usually the cast where you learn the mold. So this first pour, this is where you're going to have some defects, some little air bubbles and things like that, and that's okay, because this does a couple of things. It teaches us the mold, but it also pulls out a lot of the residual clay and things like that. So I picked most of that out before casting, but one of the things that's going to help us figure out is, when we're pouring, what way do we need to tilt the mold? Is there a particular angle that it needs to be poured at? So in this, I can already predict, because this is the kind of business side of Mothman, when we pour this, I'm going to tilt it at a slight angle so that the air bubbles can come up, and then as it's tilted back, then they rise to the top. So in theory, that's what it looks like this mold is going to take. But again, the first pour is what determines that. And again, this is not really a resin casting video. I just want to throw this in at the end just so you guys can see what Mothman looks like. Now, because I want this a nice brown color, I am going to pour up Mothman in some of our new Art Cast Translucent and just add some brown pigment to that. And the reason for that is the translucent doesn't undergo a color change. So that allows us to get a true color. So if we make it brown, the brown that we make it in this stage will be the final brown color. And for our pigment, we're going to use some of our Polypig brown. It's, see the little pig on there that Larry drew? So it's poly because it's polyurethane, and pig because it's pigment. Get it? So we're just going to put a little bit of brown in there. So the pigment is very concentrated, so it does not take much to get a really good color. And I mixed up probably more resin than I need here. So again, we're just going to pour that in, and now it comes up to the top, and I'm going to tilt the mold back a little bit and let any excess go into the mixing cup. And just shake that a little bit, and that hopefully just dislodges some of those bubbles that'll be in his little Mothman face. And now we're ready to fill it up the rest of the way. And again, this is just remember, the whole point of this particular ArtCast translucent formula is it doesn't undergo a color change, doesn't change to an opaque white or off-white. So that's important if you're trying to color match a specific part, or if you need a really dark, rich color that you typically can't get with some of those resins that change color and turn to more of a pastel color. Okay, we are now ready to demold our little Mothman. Our resin has set up completely. And it's important to know that with the ArtCast translucent, one of the little idiosyncrasies of that product is it does stay a little bit flexible right after it's set. So even though it is cured for a little bit, for probably about an hour or two after it sets, these really thin sections are going to feel like really firm rubber. So if you're doing parts that you're worried about warping, just keep them in the mold longer or lay them on a flat surface. But that is a side effect of that translucency. And again, when that cures to full hardness, it's actually a really hard, I think it's about a 75 Shore D. Oh, and look at our Mothman. There we go. So here's our completed Mothman, and as you can see, we have a few little air bubbles right down here at his little Mothman feet, but other than that, and just a couple of places up on his little Mothman face, he came out perfect. So minor work, and this little guy would be perfect cast to sell. So there you have the process of using the new 5092 silicone to make a cut block mold. And we are now ready to go into production making little Mothmen. So again, big thanks to our friend Michael Brower for his sculpture here. Excellent job on the Mothman and his interpretation thereof. So those of you new to our channel, be sure to check the video description. We have links to all of the products we use in our videos. Will always be in the video description. And in addition to that, I'm going to put a link to our video library page on block molds. So a lot of good resources there on mold making. So be sure to check that out as well. And of course, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe and click the little bell icon so you get notified when we post new content. And thanks for watching.